It's often said that the films of Stanley Kubrick deal with the dehumanization of human beings. They give us a picture of what a person looks like when their humanity has been stripped away. Nowhere is this more explicit than in his film A Clockwork Orange, where, as the title indicates, a human is made into a metaphorical machine, a mechanical fruit. The startling assertion is that things like human identity, selfhood, and one's very nature are not immutable characteristics. It is possible for another person or group of people to destroy our humanness. Not only does A Clockwork Orange claim to show us how this is possible, but perhaps more than any other Kubrick film, it wants to show us that this is a real problem for us in modern times. While for some people, the thought of fundamentally transforming human nature holds exciting possibilities, A Clockwork Orange wants to show us how this can go wrong very easily. In fact, the idea that our human nature can be tampered with should actually horrify us. Furthermore, experimentation on the minds and bodies of criminals and mental health patients is not merely a problem of the distant past, nor merely a future possibility. It's a real possibility for us right now, because experiments like this actually happened within living memory. In this video, I want to break down some of the real-life history behind A Clockwork Orange, as well as examine its themes of human nature, free will, and the human sense of justice. We'll find that different ways of looking at these things lead to very different kinds of societies, some of them more dystopian than others. As you may remember, the film tells the story of Alex DeLarge, a young, charismatic criminal who commits violent acts against innocent people just because he thinks it's fun, and really for no other reason. When Alex is eventually caught by police and sentenced to 14 years in prison for murder, he volunteers for an experimental conditioning technique that is meant to make it so that Alex is physically incapable of committing crimes. The idea being that he can then be released back into society as a perfectly obedient, model citizen. This technique is based on the idea of aversion therapy, a technique that tries to change human behavior by associating undesirable habits with unpleasant, bad experiences. For example, most people don't commit violent crime because, for them, it is an unpleasant experience. It involves confrontation, danger, or risks that might have undesired repercussions. But people who do become criminals see these things differently. They can commit crimes because they hope to find some kind of reward in it. If there was a way where we could make it so that crime makes a criminal feel terrible, then that person will presumably stop being a criminal and become like other law-abiding citizens, neither wanting nor able to commit crime. In A Clockwork Orange, this effect is achieved by forcing Alex to watch images of violence and crime, clamping his eyes open, and injecting drugs into his system that will make him feel sick, nauseous, and panicked as he is seeing this violence. The goal is that Alex's nervous system will develop an association between feelings of pain and debilitating sickness with acts of violence, so that any time he thinks of these kinds of criminal acts, his body will feel the same sickness that he felt before, and he will actually be incapacitated. And this is exactly what happens in the film. After Alex's treatment is complete, the Minister of the Interior puts on a demonstration which shows us that Alex now has this new response programmed into his body. He is incapable of fighting back against violence, and he becomes sick at the thought of assaulting a woman. As far as the politicians and scientists are concerned, this means the technique is successful. They have made what they consider in their philosophy to be a model citizen. Yet for most of us, something feels undeniably off about the whole thing. Something tells us that what's being done to Alex is deeply wrong. And there's one character in the film who agrees with us. The prison chaplain. He seems to be the only person in the room who sees the Ludovico technique as being deeply immoral, and according to Kubrick, he alone is the moral voice of the film, challenging the ruthless opportunism of the state. Despite being Comical, gullible, naive, and simplistic, the ideas he expresses are at the very heart of the film's message. The chaplain believes that when human beings cannot make choices, they cease to be human, and so he warns Alex not to volunteer for the technique because he is afraid of what it will turn him into, urging Alex instead to work on changing himself internally.
The question is whether or not this technique really makes a man good. Goodness comes from within. Goodness is chosen. When a man cannot choose, he ceases to be a man.
After the Ludovico technique, the prison chaplain points out that, despite the effects of the treatment, Alex has not really changed at all. Mentally, in terms of his desires, he still wants to do wrong. The Ludovico technique simply inhibits him from carrying out those desires. No matter how deeply technology may manipulate his body, there is something in Alex that simply cannot be touched or manipulated from the outside. The scientists cannot change Alex's desires or his will of inclination, even if they can hamper his will of execution or his physical ability to act on his own desires. The point here is not merely that it is immoral or unethical to force change on people, that we ought not to do it, but that there is some sense in which we cannot. There is a remnant dimension in every human being that is untouchable by any outsider. The materialistic scientists of the film aren't just wrong morally, they are wrong factually. Man is not a mere machine. Even if you reduce him to springs and gears, you cannot make him a mere clock. He will, even at his lowest, be a clockwork orange, a conflicted combination of machine and inscrutable humanity. Yet, on the other hand, the film warns us that despite the vestiges of Alex's inner freedom, the Ludovico technique remains a horrifying vision of how the human body might be controlled or broken by technology. The Ludovico technique is unquestionably effective at hijacking Alex's body and using it to control his actions. This is the second problem because, according to the chaplain, this means that Alex is no longer capable of true, genuine moral choice.
He ceases to be a wrongdoer. He ceases also to be a creature capable of moral choice.
The response to the chaplain's objections is, so what?
We're not concerned with motives, with a higher ethics. We are concerned only with cutting down crime.
Do we modern people really care about true goodness? Whatever that means. If we can be safe and live our lives and have whatever we want, so long as it doesn't hurt anyone else, why should we care about some concept of goodness or righteousness? In the end, it doesn't really matter if people have different opinions about what's good or moral. While many people might think this way, A Clockwork Orange dogmatically rejects the moral agnosticism of the political regime and the scientific establishment, claiming, on the contrary, that there is one way in which human beings must be viewed, and that a solid conception of the good is essential. While there is a time and place for differing opinions on different subjects, the question of morality and human nature is not a matter of abstract theorizing. Our beliefs, or lack thereof, about human nature and human responsibility have society-shaping consequences. If we don't have a respect for moral agency, or the requisite transcendent moral framework, then the result is that we compromise our very humanity itself. Kubrick himself lays out the stakes for us in simple terms by saying, "The central idea of the film has to do with the question of free will. Do we lose our humanity if we are deprived of the choice between good and evil? Do we become, as the title suggests, a clockwork orange?" Recent experiments in conditioning and mind control on voluntary prisoners in America have taken this question out of the realm of science fiction. Thus, to be more specific, A Clockwork Orange is a social satire dealing with the question, of whether behavioral psychology and psychological conditioning are dangerous new weapons for a totalitarian government to use to impose vast controls on its citizens and turn them into little more than robots. For Kubrick, A Clockwork Orange was not a mere theoretical thought experiment. It was a focused attack on the prevailing science of the time, a science that he believed fundamentally misunderstood human nature and would lead to horrific societal consequences. In fact, it already had. He mentions that experiments like the one in A Clockwork Orange were already being conducted by the 1970s. But what experiment was he referring to exactly? Well, it turns out that by the time A Clockwork Orange was released, prison inmates and mental patients were being subjected to various experimental techniques which sought to modify their behavior. And just like in the film, the goal was to cure patients of mental illnesses and/or violent behavior so that they could be released back into society. By 1972, we could find a note in the Southern California Law Review entitled "Conditioning and Other Technologies Used to Treat, Rehabilitate, Demolish Prisoners and Mental Patients." This note contemplated the place of behavior control techniques like drug therapy, aversion therapy, or psychosurgery, which refers to operating on the brain, in prisons and mental institutions, stating optimistically, right at the outset, that technological advances in the field of behavioral control already provide a growing power to intervene in the non-intellectual functions of the brain, for example, moods and emotional states. They may soon provide the ability to enhance memory and intelligence and, consequently, to change the nature of man in some fundamental ways. Reformers have been quick to suggest the use of these techniques to solve numerous and varied problems. Doctors B.F. Skinner and Jose Delgado, for example, have written books discussing the use of behavior control techniques to develop new and better worlds. Of course, not everyone would be so optimistic as the followers of B.F. Skinner. In fact, the prospect of using these kinds of quote-unquote organic therapies in behavior control would reveal dark and troubling possibilities. In 1974, the Southern California Law Review published an article by Michael H. Shapiro, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Southern California, in which Professor Shapiro states that psychotropic or mind-altering drugs, electrical stimulation of the brain by implantation of electrodes, psychosurgery, and organic conditioning techniques are now available for extensive use by the state in controlling criminal, sick, or otherwise aberrant or unwanted behavior. While these methods of control, called organic therapies, have already brought substantial improvements in the treatment of mental illness, they portend substantial danger for personal freedom. Some of these therapies have already been used on various occasions, in clearly objectionable ways, for clearly objectionable purposes. Consider, for example, the experiments in aversion conditioning with the drug anectine performed at the California Medical Facility Hospital. These chilling exercises, carried out on unwilling as well as quote-unquote consenting inmates, were described by the quote-unquote therapists at Vacaville as an attempt to evaluate the effectiveness of an aversive treatment program utilizing anectine as a means of suppressing such hazardous behavior as, for example, repeated assaults or self-harm. The drug was selected for use as a means of providing an extremely negative experience for association with the behavior in question. Anectine, when injected intramuscularly, results in complete muscular paralysis, including temporary respiratory arrest. How severe is the anectine experience from the point of view of the patient? 16 likened it to dying. 3 of these compared it to actual experiences in the past in which they had almost drowned. The majority described it as a terrible, scary experience. Well, doesn't that sound familiar?
Very soon now, the drug will cause the subject to experience a death-like paralysis, together with deep feelings of terror and helplessness. One of our early test subjects described it as being like death, a sense of stifling or drowning.
So if it's not clear what's going on, basically, according to this article, therapists at Vacaville Medical Facility in California were giving a drug to inmates that would make them feel like they were dying or drowning in order to make them stop being violent or to get them to try and stop harming themselves. Obviously, I get that when prisoners are being violent, they need to be restrained, but this seems to be a methodical program of drug regimens that not only tried to change an inmate's personality, but by any common sense standard, it amounts to nothing short of torture. It's not surprising that Shapiro rightly concludes that legislators and courts should bring under their aegis the problem of controlling the use of behavior control technologies, like the ones we've just mentioned. Such regulation ought to ensure that rigorous restraints are placed on any state efforts toward mental demolition masquerading as therapy. Such gross assaults upon personal autonomy should dispatch any notions that officialdom in general, or the medical profession in particular, can safely be left to their own devices in determining the natures of and occasions for intervention in human mentation for purposes of achieving mind/behavioral control. Thankfully, it does seem that in the criminal justice system, these more invasive methods of conditioning have fallen out of favor. Legislation has passed attempting to protect the integrity of individual thought and mentation, as well as crucially controlling the use of organic therapies. Of course, the very nature of medical treatment itself leaves wiggle room for people's bodies to be tampered with on some conditions. The law has to leave room for various surgeries and medications that remain helpful and necessary in certain situations. Ultimately, I, a humble YouTuber, cannot tell you what is going on in America's prisons or mental facilities today. But if you look up the official websites, you'll find that while the American justice system still practices behavior modification, words that still sound undeniably ominous, the National Institute of Corrections favors methods like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a good thing because it is an approach which not only seems to genuinely reduce recidivism, but philosophically assumes that most people can become conscious of their own thoughts and behavior and then make positive changes to them. A person's thoughts are often the result of experience, and behavior is often influenced and prompted by these thoughts. Thus, the individual's behavior is, ideally, placed in their own hands. It's an approach that reflects the chaplain's old-fashioned views that goodness comes from within. Goodness is chosen. Obviously, what we've discussed here is far from the whole picture, which is far beyond the scope of this video. While I could say 10,000 things, I will limit myself to saying that perhaps the preeminent crisis of our time, invading all spheres of society, not just the criminal justice system, is the question of human nature. This is what A Clockwork Orange is about. What is a human being? Can human nature be fundamentally changed? What happens when social institutions are built on a false view of human nature? What will happen if we try to augment our physical bodies with technology or drugs? Is it good or right even for us to freely consent to having ourselves changed? Remember, Alex DeLarge volunteered for the Ludovico technique. He only wanted it to be stopped when it made him sick, and again when it compromised his enjoyment of Beethoven. This doesn't change the fact that he technically signed off his consent to the technique in writing. We could argue that he couldn't really consent to the treatment if he didn't know exactly what it involved, yet we could counter-argue with equal force that he made the choice to sign the paperwork knowing that he didn't know what was involved, and not caring, even after the Padre warned him about the dangers. I think this is a crucial point. A Clockwork Orange is not warning us about a government coming in and forcing change on us against our wills, so much as it is warning us not to volunteer for being changed, or having our bodies tampered with contrary to nature. We are being warned not to sign the open-ended contract in the first place. If we do, we might find out down the road that our transformation has made us miserable in ways that we could easily have foreseen. And this is basically what the second half of A Clockwork Orange is all about. It tries to show us the consequences of the Ludovico conditioning on Alex's life. What happens when we tamper with human nature? Well, the first thing that Alex does after being released from prison is to return to his parents' house. They make a show of being happy to see him, and maybe they are, but they won't take him back in, since they've already given his room to a paying tenant named Joe. Threatened with being tossed into the street without money or possessions, Alex pitifully says that he's suffered, and that it looks like he'll just have to go on suffering. But this draws no pity from Joe.
You've made others suffer. It's only right that you should suffer proper. You know, I've been told everything you've done sitting here at night round the family table, and pretty shocking it was to listen to. It made me real sick, a lot of it did.
Not only does this scene introduce the idea that behavioral rehabilitation by itself does not guarantee reintegration into society, it confronts us with the idea that rehabilitation and release from prison might not be seen as just by society, especially from the standpoint of the victims. As far as the innocent are concerned, it's only right that the guilty should go on suffering, because from their perspective, there's still an outstanding debt to be paid. This is a belief that is shared by everyone that Alex continues to encounter through the rest of the film. As he wanders hapless, pondering drastic measures, he encounters the homeless man he and his gang had beaten up at the beginning of the film, and in an unexpected display of charity, Alex gives the homeless man some money. An act of kindness? Is this some hint of true moral reformation? Well, it doesn't do him much good, because when the homeless man recognizes who Alex is, he and his cohort of vagabonds proceed to attack Alex. It turns out a small act of kindness doesn't quite make up for an act of brutality. Before anything serious can happen, Alex is saved by two police officers who turn out to be two of his former gang members, and they just pick up where the homeless mob left off, beating him and leaving him half dead. Why do they do this? Maybe they still feel bitter about the way he treated them, or maybe it's because they still simply take delight in cruelty. It doesn't really matter. In the end, Alex ends up at the house of the writer, whose wife Alex had previously assaulted to so severe a degree that he believes it resulted directly in her death.
She's dead! We were assaulted by a gang of vicious young hoodlums in this house, in this very room you are sitting in now. I was left a helpless cripple, but for her the agony was too great. The doctors said it was pneumonia because it happened some months later during a flu epidemic. The doctors told me it was pneumonia, but I knew what it was. A victim of the modern age. Poor, poor girl. And now you, another victim of the modern age. But you can be helped.
The writer takes Alex in because he doesn't recognize his former assailant, but when the writer does hear Alex singing the same tune he had sung on the night of the assault, he realizes who Alex is, and he conspires with his political accomplices to use Alex's conditioning in a way that will force him to jump from a window and bid farewell to the cruel, cruel world. Thus, they can not only use this staged event to make the government look bad, but the writer will also get his sweet revenge, or justice, depending on how you think of it. It's kind of ironic that the writer is such a fierce opponent of the government's use of conditioning, yet in the end he ends up going further than the right-wing totalitarian government, which never even wanted the death penalty. At any rate, Alex surprisingly survives his fall, and it's his brain trauma that seems to undo the effects of the Ludovico technique. He discovers that he can once more enjoy Beethoven. Symbolically, his free will has been restored, and now he is truly cured. And the film ends, and we are all left wondering, how are we supposed to think about all of this? From Alex's standpoint, the Ludovico technique seems to have been a miserable failure. Not only was it a torturous process that robbed him of his love for Beethoven, but it has made him helpless. He is freed from prison only to find a bleak and unwelcoming world. Is this really more merciful than prison? Not that the government cares. They just want harmless cogs functioning in a perpetually moving machine. But this isn't quite what they get, because it turns out that the other cogs don't work well with this one, even after it's been conditioned. In their minds, by releasing Alex from prison, justice has not been served. Even if he has been horribly conditioned, and even if he has been beaten by police, why should he get to be released from prison and have a nice little time in the bathtub just singing in the rain when your wife is dead forever? Suppose you were the one who was crippled, and the one that you loved was assaulted to death. Could you allow the person who did that to just go on living with the fine possibility of a charmed life, with nothing near the consequences they've inflicted on others?
An eye for an eye, I say. Someone hits you, you hit back, do you not? Why then should not the state, very severely hit by you brutal hooligans, not hit back also? The new view is to say no. The new view is that we turn the bad into good. All of which seems to me to be grossly unjust, eh?
Does someone like Alex, who does the profound evil that he has done, deserve to go around walking when his victims can't walk, and living when his victims don't get to live? Some say yes, which is why this topic is still worth talking about. Nietzsche predicted a time in modernity when the morally languid would come to sympathize with the very criminals who damage society and hurt the innocent, writing, "There is a point of pathological softening and tenderizing in the history of society, where it even sides with those who do harm to it, the criminals, and does so quite seriously and honestly. Punishment, somehow that seems unfair to it. And it is certain that the concept punishment and should punish hurts it and causes fear. Does it suffice to render him no longer dangerous? Why still punish? Punishment itself is terrible. With this question, herd morality, the morality of timidity, draws its ultimate consequence. Whoever examines the conscience of today's European will always have to pull the same imperative from 1,000 moral folds and hiding places, the imperative of herd timidity. We want that someday there should be nothing more to fear. Someday, everywhere in today's Europe, the will and way there is called progress, quote unquote. A Clockwork Orange is a warning against exactly this type of progress. A progressivism which believes excitedly that it can go so far as to fundamentally transform human nature, to make danger go extinct. But in our optimism, we might not realize that we are in fact not improving the human condition so much as we are mangling it beyond repair. And who knows if there is any balm in Gilead. Whether or not there will be a cure for us, like there was a cure for Alex, well, that's not a hope that we should confidently bank on. We must be shepherds of human nature, safeguarding it while we can. Far from being a matter of impractical ambiguity, Kubrick focuses his lens with crystal clarity on the point where we must give no ground and allow no obfuscation. Choice. If there is a single meaning of this film, it is that when humans can no longer make choices, they cease to be human. But the fact that we must be clear on choice is far from saying that it is a simple matter. Philosopher Thomas Reid actually identified 3 different kinds of liberty in human life. Liberty that is opposed to bodily control, liberty that is opposed to obligation of law, and liberty that is opposed to necessity. The last we may have no control over. But there is a time and a place for the first and the second. They can clearly go too far, though the closer we get to the right place to stop, it's not always easy to tell exactly where we should stop and not take a single step further. Balance must be maintained at the fulcrum, and the place in the middle, where the 2 opposing ideas meet, may have no easy answer as to which side we must put our weight on at any given moment. A reality that Kubrick himself recognized, saying, on the one hand, that there is a time and place for restraining people. The idea that social restraints are all bad is based on a utopian and unrealistic vision of man. Yet, at the same time, Kubrick believed that the degree to which society should restrain people should also be limited, saying, "The film explores the difficulties of reconciling the conflict between individual freedom and social order. Alex exercises his freedom to be a vicious thug, until the state turns him into a harmless zombie, no longer able to choose between good and evil. One of the conclusions of the film is, of course, that there are limits to which society should go in maintaining law and order. Society should not do the wrong thing for the right reason, even though it frequently does the right thing for the wrong reason. If that isn't complicated enough, Kubrick's next film adds another layer of complexity. If A Clockwork Orange argues the point that, to be human, we must be able to make choices, Barry Lyndon explores what it means to be human in a life where, even if we can make choices, our choices themselves seem to be controlled or determined by fate. But that's a video for another time. As always, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. You can let me know what you thought in the comments, or you can just pop in to say hi. I usually try to be in the comments for about the first week after a video is out. After that, if you want to reach out to me directly, the best way to do so is social media: Instagram, Facebook, and now Twitter. Also, of course, email. If you want to support me, you can do so on Patreon, or you can just leave a like on the video. Links are in the description, and thank you again. I will see you next time.